All of you, and thank you for being at this Sunday at the Abbey event. You may or may not be aware that this year, across a span of 5 of these presentations, we're taking seriously Pope Francis's invitation to reflect on mercy in the church and the way we live it out from the gospel point of view, from a canonical point of view, as well as then how it extends into larger society. So that little sheet that you can get back there has the series of lectures next to the pot of coffee, okay? So it's my pleasure and privilege here this evening to welcome and to introduce Father Columba Stewart, who is this evening's presenter. Father Columba came to St. John's from the great state of Texas, but by way of his undergraduate work at Harvard, did a lot of work in languages, and then a degree at Yale in liturgical history, especially the early church liturgy. He made his first profession here in 1982 and was ordained a priest in 1990, completing those studies while he was working on his doctorate. Father Columba has published a definitive work on John Cassian, called Cassian the Monk. He's also published a fine introduction to Benedictine life called Prayer and Community, and of course a host of other scholarly articles on monastic topics. Since that period of study, Columba has worked really hard on Evagrius and other early monastic writers in an effort, really, I think, to put together a new synthesis of monastic spirituality and theology that is oriented to a time, namely our time, that is not nearly as receptive to the monastic impulse as earlier ages have been. Columba has served for 4 years as a faculty, not for 4 years, 4 years as a faculty member in the School of Theology. Slight nuance there, in the School of Theology and Seminary, with a specific focus in the monastic studies program. From 1999 to 2003, he served as formation director for the Abbey. Since 2003, he has served as the executive director of the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, as well as vice president for programs in religion and culture for the university. Some of you may have been at Father Columba's talk on Thursday afternoon, a fine presentation on the crucial preservation work of HMML. As we were noting this past week on campus, the 50th anniversary of its founding. We're delighted to have you, Columba, give this presentation on a subject matter that is dear to your heart and life. Tonight the topic is, do not crush the bruised reed, mercy in the rule of Benedict. Please give a warm Collegeville welcome to Father Columba.
Hi, everybody. So I am going to speak about something that I love tonight. I'm going to speak about the Rule of Benedict, its sources, and what you might call the sort of next phase of Benedictine spirituality, with particular reference to Gregory the Great. And then I'm going to bring it right home, well, at least to the 20th century, and maybe the 21st if I talk a little bit about some of my own monastic experience. So those of you who've heard me do this kind of thing before know that you're in for some philology. So we're going to talk about words and where they come from and how they're used. We're going to talk a little bit about the monastic tradition and the context for the Rule of Benedict, so you understand this sort of wonderful chain of influences which creates the particular gift that the Rule of Benedict represents, and also which inaugurates the great monastic tradition in which we are still, of course, playing a role today. And then I'm going to go through particular areas of the rule where we find the theme of mercy operative, whether under the actual word itself, and the word itself is a bit of a problem, or under related concepts which really communicate to us what we understand when we hear the word mercy. So it's kind of an ambitious agenda, but I'm confident from all those many years that the abbot was referring to of teaching that we can bring this thing home by 7:45, and then we can have time for a little bit of questions, conversation, and then some refreshment. So let's talk first about the context of the Rule of Benedict. And this is really crucial for understanding why the Rule of Benedict is a particular vessel or repository of the theme of mercy. So to do this, I have to start invoking some of the names that Abbot John was referring to, like Cassian and others. But the key points to look at on this diagram are the Rule of the Master appropriately in red, and then the Rule of Benedict in that nice soothing blue. Now, what does this mean? So many of you in the room know a little bit about the background to the Rule of Benedict, and know that Benedict was not, in fact, an originator of monastic spirituality or an originator of a particular monastic rule, but like most of his monastic predecessors, he received a tradition, and a tradition that expressed itself in multiple forms. And so his genius was not originality in the sense of a blank page and then creating something that hadn't existed at all. Rather, his genius, we've come to appreciate, was being able to receive a variegated tradition and then select from it wisely those things which he, on the basis of his own personal monastic experience, recognized as valid or useful. And the principal source that he utilized was this text known as the Rule of the Master. We don't know who wrote it. We don't know exactly where it was used, if in fact it was used. And the more you read the Rule of the Master, you become convinced that this is some paranoid monastic superior's exercise, and golly gee, if I could have the monastery of my dreams, this is the rule they would follow. But it's very difficult to imagine that anybody could actually live according to the Rule of the Master. Now, I'm not going to go into why that is the case. You can take a class on the rule for me sometime and probe the paranoid delusions of the Master in great detail. Rather, what I want to suggest from this chart is that in the Rule of the Master, you find this figure channeling a certain strand of the monastic literary tradition in Latin, represented by what we might call the tough bits of John Cassian. John Cassian, Latin monastic author, active in the 14s and 420s. He brings the monastic traditions of Egypt and Palestine to the Latin West by writing up his own personal experiences, as well as a summary of the relevant literature for a kind of burgeoning monastic movement in southern Gaul. And he is traditionally associated with the city of Marseille. There's some historical issues with that, but we're going to go with it. I think it's still a reasonably valid assumption. So Cassian, like all of us, was composed of the kind of tough, disciplined side, and then the kind of softer, mystical, spiritual side. And the problem with Cassian is people have tended sometimes to break those parts apart separately. And so the Master channels Cassian on obedience, Cassian on discipline, and his rule is characterized by really little mercy. So in terms of our theme this evening, it's not the go-to place. So Benedict inherits the Rule of the Master and salvages much of its fundamental spiritual teaching, but he places it within an entirely new frame. And that entirely new frame is one informed by two principal sources. One of them is Augustine, and the other one is the nice bits of Cassian, the mystical Cassian, the Cassian on prayer and compunction, the Cassian on the feeling of the heart, the Cassian on the delights of the spiritual life to be realized even now, as opposed to the Cassian of the Master, who's all about submission of the will to legitimate authority and grit your teeth and hold on, and maybe in the next life, you'll get a little consolation. So we are grateful for Benedict's reading of Augustine, and it is the Augustine, not that we sometimes caricature as being the hardline theologian of the Pelagian controversy, if that's ringing a bell for you, the Augustine who's sometimes dismissed as being anti-body, anti-human, anti-sexuality. So Augustine had his bad days too, right? This is the Augustine who is, in fact, the great theologian of charity, and the Augustine who writes the first monastic rule in the Latin West, which was written around 397 for his monastic community in Hippo. It's a remarkable document, which continues to be used by a lot of religious congregations today because it's brief, it's fairly generic, but it is infused with sensitivity to a variety of temperaments, a variety of needs, and the supreme imperative in the monastic life of charity. And of course, if charity is your supreme imperative, mercy is the essential means of attaining it. So that's our background, okay? So if you're interested in this stuff, let me know. I'll send you the Rule of Augustine. It's really intriguing. And all the nice lines we love in the Rule of Benedict, like in chapter 64 and some of that stuff, it's all shamelessly plundered from Augustine, often verbatim, but it's good stuff. All right, so let's talk about words. So we move from historical context to etymology. So our English word mercy is actually based on one of two possible Latin words that are in our kind of linguistic ambit this evening. And it's really literally representing the Latin word merces. And this word normally means merit or reward. So we find it in terms like mercenary. He did that for mercenary reasons, so that he would be paid or rewarded. The plural, mercedes, of course, is the name of a very nice reward in the form of a very expensive car. So that kind of makes the point, in a sense, of what we're talking about here. Now, this is a term that is used in the Rule of Benedict frequently, and it's used in the Rule of Benedict in the sense of reward or merit for things that we do. It's a reward for service. So at the end of the Tools for Good Works in chapter 4, you receive a reward, a merces, for the good works that you have done, which are outlined in all of those many verses of chapter 4 and its tools. Similarly, in chapters 35 and 36, when you serve in the kitchen, when you serve the sick, you receive a reward for your service. On the other hand, chapter 49 on Lent, if you go off and hang from your eyelids throughout the whole of Lent and refuse to eat anything except the odd dried bean, and you do this without the abbot's permission, because he would never give you permission to do something so crazy, all of that discipline and effort merits no reward. And then, just to keep everybody in the room humble, he says in chapter 64 that if you block a wicked abbot from doing what he wants to do, you will receive a very nice reward, he says, a fine reward for this. Now, what is the reward that he's talking about? It's not cash, it's not goods in kind, it's not passes to Bravo Burrito or to the movie theater. What he's talking about is the reward for the Christian life well lived, which is principally understood in the rule as eternal life. So it's an element of the early monastic consciousness which is less foregrounded in modern Christian experience. Because what sold Christianity in its early centuries and what motivated most people to undertake monastic life throughout most of monastic history was this promise of an eternal reward, because often, for most people throughout human history, life in this world was not so great. So this is a bit of a challenge sometimes for us when we read this literature, what we call this eschatological understanding, that the payoff comes later. But it's very important to note that one of the key differences between the Rule of the Master in red and the Rule of Benedict in that nice soothing blue is that Benedict allows that even in this life, we can begin to have a foretaste or experience of that reward, which is God's mercy in its perfect fullness in the next life. And this is in deliberate opposition to the stance of the Master, where there is reward only in the next life. And here you suffer for the sake of that future reward. But Benedict, in a sense, sort of cracks open the door of heaven to allow little bit of that divine light, which Gregory the Great mentions in the dialogues, to shine on us even now. So thus, at the end of the prologue, the famous phrase that we run on the path of life with our heart expanding with the inexpressible delight of love is not found in the parallel text of the Master. And similarly, Benedict's Ladder of Humility in chapter 7, with its 12 steps, ends with the monk climbing to the top of the ladder, attaining the perfect love which casts out fear, and doing that in this life. Whereas for the Master, the reward of climbing those steps of humility is exclusively in the next life. So Benedict wants his monks to taste a bit of sweetness, even in this life, and this is what makes this language of reward or merit understandable. And we all know what he means, that we find satisfaction, we find joy in the service that we provide, and we understand this as a kind of token of what will be perfectly fulfilled when we are entirely with God and entirely with each other in this thing we call the communion of saints. So that's mercy 1. Mercy 2, and what we usually mean by our English word mercy, is rendered by the Latin word misericordia. And this is the term that occurs in places that resonate more with this evening's theme. So, for example, again in the Tools for Good Works, never despair of God's mercy. This multivalent concept that we'll be exploring more this evening. Chapter 37, it is natural to show mercy to the old and the young. And notice that God shows mercy, and so do we. And this is a very important aspect of what Benedict does in the Rule, again in contrast to the Master. In the Master's system, it's only God who can do these good things. All we can do is suffer and maybe receive in the end. But throughout the Rule of Benedict is this understanding that we too are bearers of divine mercy and comfort and healing to each other. So it's a real empowerment of the human person. In chapter 53, the verse which is sung when the guest is brought into the church, we have received, O God, your mercy within your temple. The arrival of the guest, of the stranger, is itself an expression of God's mercy. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. And finally, in that catalog of advice to the abbot in chapter 64, this little bullet points of qualifications, like in those position descriptions that many of us have to work with and live with in the modern age, those bullet points that the abbot should be chaste, sober, and misericordious. He should be merciful, which ties in with the very title of this evening's talk, that the abbot or anyone else who exercises authority in the community, which for Benedict is not simply the abbot, but ultimately everyone in that atmosphere of mutual obedience and good zeal, that we are to show mercy. So those are our words. That's the end of, almost the end of philology and etymology tonight. All right? So now let's look at how this works in practice in the teaching of the Rule. And there is no better place really to do this than to look at chapter 53 on the reception of the guests. Now, I've taught the Rule many, many times in various contexts. I do workshops, I give retreats. I always find something new. And as I finally turned my attention to this evening's talk at some point late yesterday afternoon, and then returned to it again sometime late this afternoon, I was struck when I was working with chapter 53 at the repetition of a particular Latin verb. Now, I'm a word guy, so I naturally gravitate to things like, the concordance at the back of the Rule and this kind of thing. But this notion of expressing or showing in chapter 53 seemed to fit very well with what I want to say this evening. The Latin verb exhibeatur. So whatever it is to be shown or manifested. You don't just think about it. You don't sort of keep it inside. You don't say, well, I'll do that tomorrow. You are to show it. You are to manifest it. And so look at this extraordinary description of the reception of the guest in chapter 53. And when you break it down into a kind of spiritual choreography, it is all the more remarkable. And with its inclusion, a beginning with Christ received in the guest and ending. So, basic point of the chapter, of course, is that when the guest comes, Christ is received. Many important chapters of the rule begin with a kind of thesis statement, a maxim, a simple assertion, and the rest of the chapter explains what that means in a particular context. So Christ is received in the guest. So what this obliges the community to do are the following points. First of all, honor, and it's the same word in Latin, honor is to be shown to all. So somebody comes, whoever it is, and he says all, and you are to show them honor. Now remember, this is the 6th century, which was even more class-ridden and socioeconomically stratified than our own day. And this is saying that no matter who they are, you show them honor. And indeed, this honor or deference is shown, again, same verb, in physical posture. So in a society where underlings or subordinates would naturally manifest their subordinate position by bowing, kneeling, prostrating, groveling in some sort of form, Benedict says that the members of the community who receive a guest, any guest, are to do the same thing. And so this physical expression of the honor that is owed to the guest because the guest is Christ, manifested in the bowed head or the prostration, which we are paying to Christ. So it is to be shown. He then says, after you pray with them, and after you share a little bit of scripture, because that is the best food that we can provide our guest, he says, we are to show them all humanitas. And humanitas occurs only once in the Rule of Benedict, but it is another way of talking about mercy. So we show our guest all humanitas, all concern that we can provide for every aspect of them as a human being. Their physical needs, their spiritual needs, their emotional needs. We show them humanitas in recognition of the humanitas that they have brought to us, the humanitas that we have received in God's temple as we praise God for bringing his mercy in our midst. And then finally, this inclusion, wrapping up the initial point, that we are to show the greatest care and concern. And he underscores this, the greatest care and concern to the poor and the pilgrim, because in them Christ is especially received. So you get the idea then that the arrival of the guest, and ultimately, of course, he broadens this lens to mean everybody we meet, even those same darn people we've lived with forever, whom we know so well and drive us crazy on a daily basis, and who also reward us with their fidelity and presence, that all of them are bearers of God's mercy to us and call forth from us our expression of humanitas, which we are to show to them, we are to exhibit to them. So if we think about that very kind of dynamic and enacted understanding of mercy evident in chapter 53, this allows us then to wander into other places where our theme is expressed in ways that might be a little more personal. And so let's talk a little bit about prayer. And to talk about prayer in the Rule of Benedict means we have to talk about compunction. And so one of my goals this evening is to rescue the theme of compunction. So we hear that word and we think, oh, it means I'm sorry. It means that I'm sort of afflicted for my sinfulness. It means I kind of beat up on myself. It's something I need to sort of work through and get over. But the wonder of the monastic tradition, as it comes to us in our own rule, but as it came to Benedict from Cassian, and this is Cassian's good bits, or some of Cassian's good bits that I was talking about earlier, is that compunction is not something that happens to us when we screw up and that prods us to do better for next time, and then we can sort of shake it off after we've dealt with whatever it was we were dealing with, or after we've gone to confession, or after we're out of our bad mood. But rather, compunction is the permanent state of the Christian. Because compunction is used in these texts to describe an intensity of spiritual awareness, which includes both sorrow for sin and the recognition of God's mercy, and the joy that we experience in recognition of God's mercy, coming to us in those 1,000 ways that it does. In the guest who brings us an unexpected opportunity for service, or who shows us something about the world that we had never seen before until we saw the world through that person's eyes, or whatever else it is. So the key point is that in the rule, whenever Benedict speaks about personal prayer, it is always linked to tears, and often the language that is used to describe prayer with tears involves the word compunction. Now, we are not meant to conclude from this that this was all because he was a 6th century Italian. And Mediterranean people, unlike most Minnesotans, will cry at the drop of a hat, or that they were particularly high-strung and overwrought. Instead, he's pointing us to this very deep current in the monastic tradition, east and west, from earliest times until now, that says that when we are operating in prayer at a truly deep level of human experience, tears are never far away. And this doesn't mean that your eyes are gushing or you're uncontrollably sobbing, but it means that just like sitting in the darkened movie theater at the end of the tearjerker movie, you feel a little moistening of the eyes. And this is one of the occasions when American males are allowed to feel this, of course. Birth of a child, a movie, maybe a sports event. Women tend to be freer, but in the monastic tradition, we're all meant to be free. And that the test of real prayer is descending to that level of the heart or the spirit where the tears are not far away. So thus, in chapter 4 on the tools for good works, he tells us that one of the things we're meant to do is to devote ourselves frequently to prayer, he says, every day confessing our past sins to God in prayer with tears and sighing. So that's kind of classic, typical understanding of compunction. Compunction is contrition or sorrow. Then in chapter 20 on prayer, he writes, we know that we will not be heard by God because of many words, but we will be heard in our purity of heart and in the compunction of our tears, which is not sorrow, it is sincerity. It is a purity of intention. Chapter 49, the chapter on the observance of Lent. We will do well in Lent if we refrain from vices, and instead turn our attention and energy to prayer with tears, to reading, to compunction of heart, to the work of abstinence. And finally, chapter 52 on the Oratory, the Monastery. If one wishes to pray privately, he says, go in, just pray. Not out loud in a big, loud, dramatic voice, but with tears and intention of heart. It's interesting that of those 4 key texts of the Rule of Benedict on prayer, only the first of those derives from the Master. All the rest of this is Benedict describing for his monks based on the rich work of Cassian in his 9th conference, if you're interested in the details, where he describes centuries before William James, a great chronicler of varieties of religious experience, all the ways that we experience the Spirit profoundly. And Cassian, in that sort of tail end of Conference 9, talks about the fact that we are sometimes overwhelmed with awareness of God's presence in a way that we can no longer express in words. And he says at other times, we're so exuberant with God's presence that we want to run out of ourselves and start screaming with joy, which would probably not be a good thing for most of us to do here. Misunderstood. He says, at other times, we're so keenly aware of our failure to serve God that we are overwhelmed with tears. So this variety of religious experiences, all of which he puts under the term compunction. So compunction means getting to the level of true spiritual reality. And that level of reality is both keen awareness for one's failure, and it is extraordinary gratitude for the fact that God has brought us to this day. To recognize that, to receive the gift of healing and mercy that comes to us in those 100 ways each day, and then to weep no longer tears of sorrow for our sin, but tears of joy and gratitude. The 12th step of humility. So what's the most important chapter of the Rule of Benedict, class? It's 7. Okay, 7's interesting because 7's from the Master, except as I told you, Benedict changes it very importantly, in a very significant way, by putting the reward for climbing that ladder of humility within the present life. Now, if you read chapter 7, and many of you have, you may know that at the ultimate step of that progression of humility, you find the description of a monk. And this monk, he says, is constantly saying to himself in his heart what the tax collector says in the gospel, with eyes fixed to the earth, cast down. Lord, I am not worthy, I a sinner, to lift my eyes to heaven. So this can sound to us like a kind of starting point, that we begin with a confession of sinfulness and then we work our way up from there. But in fact, Benedict puts this at the pinnacle of his teaching on humility, and the other parts of the description of the perfectly humble monk tell us why. He says that this person does this in church, in the garden, on a journey, wherever he is. He's the same person in whatever context. He is no longer able, because he's worked these steps of humility described in chapter 7, to pretend to be anything other than what he is. So no more games, no more masks, no more church voice or office face. It's all the same person all the time because of this profound awareness that he is a sinner, but also he is a sinner who is confident enough in God's mercy to stand, as Benedict writes, as if already at the fearful judgment, and not to be afraid to stand there. So it's a remarkable description of perfection. Now this bears fruit in the teaching of Gregory the Great. And Gregory, the biographer of Benedict, is known in the medieval tradition as the Doctor of Desire. And it is Gregory who takes this trajectory of Cassian on compunction, Benedict on tears and prayer, and links it to this powerful element coming from St. Augustine, which describes the power of love and desire. And this is what creates the spirituality of the Middle Ages, which is, in a sense, the true Benedictine legacy, where this whole range of human experience, both negative and positive, is all brought together at the same time. And we can no longer describe life as happening in phases or alternations or binaries, but life is always both. That regret for sin, that desire for God, that compounded experience of the two, which expresses itself naturally in tears. And thus it's Gregory who writes this extraordinary, I must admit, rather long and sometimes boring, but still extraordinary, commentary on the book of Job. Because if you want to write about tears and sorrow and regret, and you want to put a positive spin on it, the ultimate challenge is to do this in writing a commentary on the book of Job. And Gregory uses the story of Job as the occasion to teach his monks about what compunction means in all of its richness. And of course, the Byzantine tradition does this in the teaching of the Jesus Prayer, which echoes what Benedict describes as the prayer of the monk in the 12th step of humility. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner, building from the same gospel text of the Gospel of Luke that Benedict, following the Master, uses to describe the prayer of the truly humble monk. This is one of the very important places where the monastic tradition of the West touches the monastic tradition of the East. And this is important because the soil of the Western monastic tradition was essentially imported from the monasticism of Egypt, of Palestine, of Cappadocia, which is in modern-day Turkey. The attentive readers of the rule know that the only monastic authority quoted by name in the Rule of Benedict is Basil the Great, who of course is an Eastern monastic writer. He never cites Cassian, he never cites Augustine or Jerome, he cites only Basil. And if you study the monasticism of the Eastern churches, you know that this practice of what they call the Jesus prayer, whether in the Greek tradition or the Russian tradition, is the central prayer of the monk. And this is the monk's vade mecum, the prayer which is always available. Now, in the Western tradition, we certainly have the 12th step of humility. We also have the teaching of Cassian in Conference 10, where he says that we should learn to practice the prayer, God come to my assistance, Lord make haste to help me, as a formula that we can repeat over and over and over, no matter what we're doing. So you're feeling bad, you don't know what to pray, you can't put two thoughts together, God come to my assistance, Lord make haste to help me. You can't sleep, God come to my assistance, Lord make haste to help me. You're working, and you can't be reading, doing Lectio while you're working, but you can pray, God come to my assistance, Lord make haste to help me. And Cassian describes this as a monologistic, single, short, focused prayer, which then connects to the rest of our praying experience of psalms, of other scriptural readings, of the hymns we sing in the office, and so on. And this becomes, as it were, the thread out of which one makes the net, which holds all of that variety of monastic practices and forms of liturgy and forms of devotion, and so on. The Eastern tradition takes it one step further, ultimately, by adding to that notion of a short prayer formula these explicit elements that are on the slide here. The name of Jesus, the claim in faith that he is the Christ, the Son of God, and the particular appeal for mercy, remembering that the fundamental Christian prayer is Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy. And if you ever go to an Eastern Rite liturgy, so some of my students this semester are doing that in our class on Eastern Christianity, there are at least 400 Lord have mercies in that liturgy. This is imported into early Christian personal prayer practice as well, as the Lord have mercy becomes the go-to prayer. But the genius of the tradition as it moves through the 5th century, the 6th century, roughly at the time of Benedict's work in the West, is to craft this prayer, which puts it all together. And so if you want to know what my bottom line recommendation, takeaway tonight, for how do you make mercy more present in your life, the answer is the Jesus prayer, which has been popularized in the West through things ranging from translations of the great Russian work, The Way of the Pilgrim, to J.D. Salinger's Franny and Zooey, a novel published in the 1960s, which talks about the Jesus prayer in an unexpected 20th century manner. But this is where it comes home to practice. And this is why this is essentially the prayer of Benedict's perfect monk in the 12th degree of humility. So let's continue this theme then by talking a little more about tears of sorrow, tears of joy. So we've said a little bit already about the ubiquity of tears in what Benedict says about prayer. But you don't have to go very far in looking at other texts in the monastic tradition to understand that tears become a privileged symbol, as I said earlier, of touching a depth of spiritual experience, but also the symbol of somebody who has become a mature person, So we may think that somebody who's on crying jags is immature, hasn't sort of worked out their stuff, hasn't gotten over it, hasn't grown up, hasn't pulled themselves together. But in fact, the greatest figures in the monastic tradition are the ones who were known as great weepers. So I think it was Arsenius who wept his eyelashes out. There was another one who wept so much that he had worn a groove in his chest from the flow of tears. Now, my friends, we are not meant to take this literally. We are meant to take these as ways of evoking the fact that these were people who were constantly in the presence of God's mercy, and constantly in that dual aspect of mercy, which is the mercy of forgiveness for sin and the mercy of the foretaste of the joy of heaven, which is given to us as a kind of viaticum, as a something to feed us along the way, to keep us going through the struggles of our life. This reminds me of the great saying of the Orthodox Saint Silouan of Athos, who most famously in the 20th century remarked that the monk must learn to cultivate the ability to hold the heart in hell and not despair. This is one of my favorite monastic sayings, which somehow seems to connect that early monastic tradition, which I've been speaking about so much this evening, with the reality of the horrors of the 20th century, which seem to be having a bit of a revival right now in the first part of the 21st century. That part of our duty as Christians is to be able to look at the horrible tragedies around us, whether that be the tragedy of the Armenian genocide, the centenary of which we observe this year, the tragedy of the Holocaust, the tragedy of massive refugee dislocation after World War II, affecting all sides in that conflict, the tragedy of what we see unfolding in the Middle East today, that we as Christians must learn to be able to look at that straight on, not to turn away, not to shirk it, but not to despair. And it is precisely this continual awareness of God's never-ending mercy that gives the heart the ability to do that. Woody Allen once famously observed, I'm not going to put Woody Allen up on a slide here, but I will quote him. It's one of my favorite lines. Woody Allen once observed that the heart is a tough little muscle. But the reason the heart is a tough little muscle and keeps on beating is because it is also a muscle that has been tenderized. And the tenderizing agent in the Christian life is this phenomenon of tears shed in awareness of God's mercy. So let me end with Thomas Merton to bring this back to the Western monastic movement. And the 20th century, indeed, but somebody who saw many of the things that we deal with now as a kind of prophet, seeing things coming from afar decades before his own time. Thomas Merton famously said in his Sign of Jonas the words, mercy within mercy within mercy, and he could keep going, and so could we. So let us meditate then on the gift of the monastic tradition as framing for us not only a kind of theological and spiritual concept of mercy, but also the enactment of mercy in the way that we treat each other, the way that we receive the stranger, the way that we approach God in our own prayer, and the way that we face the challenges of our world, as we were called to do by the Second Vatican Council, and as we are called to do by the Spirit of the Gospel each day, and we face them, and thanks to God's mercy, shown in our lives, shown in the lives of the people we know and love, thanks to God's mercy, we do not despair. Thank you. "7:45 on the dot. This is 35 years in show business, the fruits of practice teaching. So I believe we have, Abbot John, we have a little time for comments or questions. Is that the case? Yep. So the floor and the microphones are open.
Several weeks ago, we had a Bartimaeus sitting by the roadside as Jesus was passing by. And so I read a nice commentary on that gospel, and he used the phrase, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And so I read that on, I don't know, Friday morning, Saturday morning, went to church on Sunday, and of course a different translation says, it has Bartimaeus crying out, "Have pity on me." So talk about that a little bit.
Well, we should all learn more Greek, I guess. I'm always going to be the one to say that we should work on our languages. So this is part of the challenge with translation, obviously. And we have some of these words which have either a kind of multivalent meaning, and sometimes it's better not to translate them. And yet, in other situations, we have to make a choice. So the problem with so much of what I've been saying tonight is that you can shift from mercy to pity so easily, and pity is not a very positive word in English. So we don't like to be pitied, and pitying somebody is an act of someone who's in a kind of superior position. So I think what Benedict is doing throughout the rule, so obviously in chapter 53, but elsewhere, the chapter on rank, chapter 72, which could have been a whole nother focus of these remarks this evening, is he's leveling all of the forces in human interactions that want to create that kind of differential, where we look down on somebody and we think we're doing them a favor, or this kind of noblesse oblige approach to people that we say are less fortunate than ourselves. And the point of the rule is to say we are all equally fortunate because we have all equally been saved in Jesus Christ. We are all equally able to receive the mercy of Christ, which comes to us in this variety of ways, if we choose to recognize that. So less of pity and more of mercy. Have John.
Yeah, could you say something perhaps about chapter 27, the abbot's preoccupation with the excommunicated, and also perhaps just a linkage over to care for the sick?
Sure, so that could be part two. I was thinking about 53, a little bit about 72. The title of the talk, which was given to me, by the way, but it's a good title. I'm happy to have this title for the talk. Sort of conjures up the particular pastoral care offered to members of the community by the abbot and others who exercise a healing role in the community. And again, one of the wonders of the Rule of Benedict is he doesn't exclusively put that in the job description of the monastic superior, but in fact, each one of us can, at various points in time, exercise that role of care. So this notion of adapting response to individual circumstances and challenges is the big example of this Augustinian strand that I mentioned way at the beginning of the talk with that little family tree of influences that I mentioned. Because this rule of Augustine is the kind of text that could only have been written by somebody who was himself a very sensitive person. And I mean sensitive in the sense of able to get hurt and wounded, as well as sensitive in the sense of compassionate. And also could only have been written by somebody who came from one kind of social stratum in the late antique Roman Empire in North Africa, and really wanted to climb several notches above, and was really aware all the time of how he was looked down upon by the people in the classes to which he aspired. So his whole rule then is full of cautions for those who come from privileged backgrounds and then those who come from poor backgrounds. And it's a much fuller instantiation of what you find in the rule when Benedict talks about personal property, saying that you shouldn't be thrilled that you get something. It's a concession to weakness. And if you're really strong, then you should be grateful that you don't need it. Augustine goes much more into the way that we can play games with ourselves and assume that we deserve something because of who we are and where we come from, or equally, gosh, here's my chance to get all this stuff I never had in grade school because I'm now in this monastery which has a higher standard of living than I grew up with. So it's that context then which creates this need to discern the particular circumstances of individuals and then to respond appropriately. And part of the depth of the rule is that that discernment is not just the abbot's job. I got to be figuring out myself, because it's my self-knowledge and awareness of my particular circumstances that needs to meet his, and then perhaps the need of others in this very insightful recognition that very often it's the authority figure who is the last person who's in a position to really help, just because there's often so much static in those relationships. And Benedict's willingness to involve other people in the community in that process of discernment and approach. That's a long answer, but I don't know if I got to what you wanted. So the healing metaphor, actually I think I did write something about this once, a number of years ago. This sort of the healing metaphors in the rule with respect to this pastoral care by the abbot and by others are unique to Benedict. The master talks a lot about people being sick, but they're sick in the sense of sinful, and he doesn't talk a lot about strategies of healing. And Benedict imports not only the Augustinian sensitivity to individual circumstances, he also imports this very strong medical healing imagery to talk about the way that we deal with it. So even his term, sympecte, which some of you know is this technical term he uses for troubleshooters who help the abbot, is of unsure etymology, but it might actually be a medical term. So it's applying a particular type of compress or potion that can bring healing, and that individual people can be spoken of in that way.
Thank you. Thank you, Father Columba, for a very informative presentation. I'm thinking about your reflections in light of so much of the discussion going on today with Pope Francis's declaration of the Year of Mercy, the appeal to mercy in the recent synod. And in many of those discussions, everybody grants the priority of mercy. I mean, who can be against mercy? But then it's often sort of problematized by connecting in one way or another with justice or with truth, suggesting that mercy has to always be qualified in the light of those. I'm wondering if the rule sheds any light on the relationship between mercy and justice, or mercy and truth. For example, Pope Benedict in his encyclical Caritas in Veritate tries to deal with mercy and justice, or charity and justice. I'm just curious to know if that's something that would be addressed in the rule.
Interesting question. So I think rather than go with a justice and truth vocabulary, and the copy of the rule I brought with me tonight is not the one that has the word index in the back. I was just reaching to look if I could check that. I'm not sure that the word veritas even occurs in the rule. There might be a reference to the true king and so on. I think instead the way the rule goes at it is within the context of ascetic practice. So rather than invoking a kind of abstract understanding of what is, an eternal unchanging thing that we have to conform to, instead there's this developmental perspective that we practice certain disciplines. So it's the hours of prayer, it's fasting, it's whatever, for the sake of clarifying our own awareness of sinfulness and failure, which then has certain presumptions about what is normative in human behavior, but doesn't lead with that kind of judgmental attitude. So it's a kind of shift of locus, as it were, which is actually quite empowering. And again, the Master's Monastery. Now, we joke sometimes in the Rule of Benedict business that if the Master had not existed, we would have had to invent him, just so we could have this sort of horrible antitype to compare the Rule of Benedict to. But the Master's Monastery is all about clear boundaries, norms, violation of them, reporting violations to the abbot, not having any other empowered officials in the community, lest it disrupt this absolute authoritative rule of the abbot. And in fact, the abbot's subordinate officials in the Master's Monastery, their principal job is to be dustbusters and go around hearing thoughts of the monks and then bringing them to the abbot. So sort of like, Stalin every morning getting the report from the KGB to find out what's happening in the Soviet Union. This is the Master's Monastery. So Benedict, such a different environment. But it's an interesting question just as you ask that, so you're bringing this perspective of somebody who teaches these things. Those just aren't categories that operate in the monastic tradition. And it's an interesting question to wonder, is it just because it's all shifted to this asceticism, which is itself a tall order? And I wonder if there's something there that we might export. But we'll see.
I'm going to bring in Dorothy Day since I'm a Catholic worker, and Pope mentioned her, and also a story. I'll try to really be fast. This guy broke into my house and beat up my roommate's partner. Okay, and I had to face him down on his way up the stairs. I suggested that he go out the front door because the police were coming. And I was reflecting on how I dealt with this intruder in my bedroom in 5 a.m, and how my neighbors were telling me if I have a gun, I would have shot him. I have a staple gun, I would have slowed him down. A lot of negative, super negative, okay? So I was reflecting on them also saying I failed to protect, and a lot of negative all over the place. So, but I was reflecting on, I was feeling a tragedy of this man who's now in jail. And also what I'm going to get to point here is the corporal works of mercy as practiced in a monastery, and Dorothy getting that from the monastery. Corporal works of mercy uses the word mercy. I've done that for years, okay? And so I've been singing soup to guys like this, and I felt this pang inside. I want to go talk with him in better circumstances, because I'm used to that. I'm used to talking with folks, and they'll unpack their stories in a safe spot, and mercy will flow in a lot of different directions. But I felt a recipient of a guest with him as much as the people I failed to protect. They all three took off, and I was left with an empty house. So this is lay people working out monastic practice, or not. You guys, what would you do? Would you ever take in a person who's like lied to you and had a estranged boyfriend who was going to come over and bang up the place, and nobody paid me any rent? But what I'm caught up with is this, like, I feel the relationships were cut, and and the guy who's now in jail is somebody my heart yearns to reconnect with. So is that the simultaneity of the joy, the reward is me feeling connected. And I don't want to brag about this. If I had known any of this, I would not have ran into her. Because it's scary, and I have some PTSD again from this. But corporal works of mercy, and this whole idea of banning guns and who deserves what kind of punishment, when love flows around, that guy would not have done it. Maybe, okay? And we would have had a different circumstance. He would have come over and moved the furniture for us. It is a tragedy. So, Yeah, corporal works of mercy, man, think about it. And put your gun, melt it down, you know?
So perhaps this is where we invoke Silouan, because there are these situations that we can't resolve perfectly. And, we have them in monasteries too, the ways that we deceive each other, the ways that we hurt each other. And at the end of the day, sometimes all we can do is face the situation in our own prayer, where we find our tears of frustration, regret, sorrow, compassion, and try to reach for that understanding of what that person's life must be like that led her to that place. And that we must take that act of faith not to despair, so that we can keep them from despairing or help them keep from despairing. Absolutely. Yeah. And the Jesus prayer is an ongoing practice. That's the point. It's all the time, every day. It's your go-to. And that's a way of getting you to that level of true spiritual experience, the real self, that's signified, at least in their understanding, by the presence of tears. Maybe it's signified by something else for you, but it exists. And so much of the time that we spend day in and day out is not spent at that level. Have it, John.
I just want to say thank you, Father Columba, for and particular for this presentation, and particularly for the way in which you approached this, because I think that you drove down the street that Francis is really trying to get us to go to, and that is our own internalization and ongoing experience of the mercy of God, especially in Jesus Christ and through the Spirit. So I really, really appreciate the approach. Let's give him a warm round of applause.